I never thought I would do a podcast on food and recipes, but here we are, right?
I never thought I'd write a book about food. I can't cook. Most of the negative habits that you can think of in leadership are directly tied to or strongly correlated with difficult relationships with mom and dad, right?
Mm,
But I will say this. There's scads of research now demonstrating the importance of meal times with families for children and teens. And just about every correlation you can name, better grades, healthier outlook, less depression, more confidence, fewer eating disorders, healthier lifestyle, on and on and on. And it all comes back to this idea of meaningful meal times. And many of those studies go back even closer, more specifically to 5 meaningful meal times.
that's great. So instead of the 40-day fast, people might like this. It's 40 days of eating.
That's true. And listen, going back to the leadership conversation, Doug, I think both of us can agree. When we look around our culture right now, there is a vacuum of strong leaders.
Mhm.
And if the greatest leadership training is parenting, and we know that that's true, statistically, I'm convinced of it completely, then don't we owe it to the next generation to invest that time in leadership?
All right. Welcome to Pillars of Leadership podcast. Today, I want to welcome Dr. Ryan Rush, and he is the pastor of Kingsland Church. Been there for about 9 years, I guess.
Yeah, coming up on a decade, 2 months away from 10 years.
Amazing. And in the thriving town of Katy, Texas, and that church has grown to 5,000 under his leadership. And he's written a couple books and hosted numerous radio and TV shows focused on the family. And so I'm going to take a kind of a different twist here today, and we're going to talk about family leadership. So we've been focused a lot on corporate and educational and community and even political leadership. But I met Ryan back in 2016, I believe it was, when
Yeah,
we
that's right.
embarked on our PhD leadership journey. And so
That's right, Dr. Hagedorn. If we'd have known what we were in for, we might have warned each other, right?
we
But
might,
I'm
if we had
grateful
to
we made it
rewind the
through.
tape, would we go through it
Right.
again? That's the question, right?
That's right.
I would do it all over again. So, um, Pastor Ryan, Dr. Ryan, has been married for 31 years, has 3 daughters, went to Liberty University, and he has a new book coming out. And so I want to talk about that a little bit, called Restore the Table. But did I miss anything about yourself? You know, I could go on for hours about your history and your
Oh,
bio.
you're very kind. No, I think you nailed the highlights. I have the privilege of being an adjunct professor at Dallas Theological Seminary now, Doug, and I'm so pleased to raise up a new crop of D-Min students in marriage and family ministry. So, doing that as well, and really grateful.
Great. Hey, what brings you to this passion, Ryan, about family? What attracted you to the
Yeah.
topic? Obviously, being a pastor, that's one thing, but that goes long before this.
It really does. So, first of all, I was raised in a home where my parents really invested in me, and I'm deeply grateful for being raised in the family I was. I actually get to be my mom and dad's pastor now. So, the last 9 years, they followed us to Katy, and it's kind of a unique thing to look out and see your parents in your own congregation. So, what a blessing that is. I was in youth ministry, like many at the time, in the early 90s, late 80s, as that's what you did when you were starting ministry. I was worship ministry, youth ministry, and I recognized that the students that were doing the best when they left home weren't necessarily the ones that had access to me, but were the ones whose families, whose parents were investing in them heavily. And I just recognized that the parents were really designed as the primary faith trainer. And the best thing I could do as a minister is empower those families. And so at that time, even though we didn't call it that, Empowered Homes is our ministry now that we kind of fan the flames of out of Kingsland. But we had the seeds of that growing in. Hey, listen, what if we became the B team and the parents were the A team, and we really just empowered them to do what God designed them to do? And so, really, for the last 30 years, that's been the journey for me, is trying to figure out the best ways that I can equip parents to do that. And as you know, Doug, a little bit, when I embarked on the PhD journey in leadership, I wanted to understand how leadership and family life and parenting went hand in hand. And I am more convinced than ever that parenting is the primary leadership training on this earth. That
Mhm.
there's really not a close second. We invest billions of dollars every year in leadership training, but the reality is most of our leadership skill set is designed around family life, for good or bad, when we're growing up.
Well, yeah, you look at the first 15 years or so of a child or student's life, and who are they
Right.
spending the most time with? It is the
Mm-hmm.
teachers in the classroom, yes, but it is the family. And I did some research on this several years ago, and the average child receives 12 minutes of attention per day from their parents. And yet
Yeah.
the average parent, not to pile on to parents because it's a challenge parenting, but the average parent spends 5 to 6 hours of screen time daily.
Yeah.
And the number one problem reported by high schoolers is loneliness. And even the public educational system recognizes this, and our politicians. The Carnegie Foundation surveyed 22,000 teachers and said that 90% said parental support is a problem in their school
Mhm.
and with their student. And 100%, Ryan, described their students as emotionally needy and starved for attention and affection.
Yeah.
Shocking?
That's where we're living. Not really. No, because we've seen this playing out for a number of years. You know, it's funny. In 2000, there was a best-selling book that came out called Bowling Alone. And the whole idea was this statistician was watching, and an anthropologist, I can't call his name right now, but really interesting book where he was noticing that we used to be a nation of joiners. Everybody was a part of a club or a some get together, or the Elks or something, and now we're a nation of non-joiners. Now it's 2000, the year 2000. Think about where we are now. So we started to isolate ourselves, and then technology really took over, such that not only do we not connect in a communal way, but I can go to a restaurant after we finish today, and I guarantee you there'll be families around tables tonight at dinner, and they may be sitting there, but everyone, mom, dad, kids, they're looking down at their technology. They're not really engaging at all. And so, uh, where my area of study really led me when I was trying to understand the connection between leadership and attachment is in something called attachment science, or leadership and parenting, rather. Attachment science is something that's really arisen over the last 70 years. It's a phenomenon that's very well researched now, but it's just patterning what God told us all along, that you have a deep need for connections, and your earliest connections in your life are from those toddler years, shape how you interpret the rest of relationships from then on. And then I spent a couple of years with my dissertation exploring pastors on four continents and how they led now, and then how they looked back and how they were attached to their moms and dads. And lo and behold, most of the negative habits that you can think of in leadership are directly tied to or strongly correlated with difficult relationships with mom and dad. Right?
Mm, yeah, it's even the U.S. Department of Education gets it in a recent study. They stated that controllable home factors account for almost all of the differences in student achievement. And I read I couldn't believe this, but children were asked in one study, if you had to pick one person as a role model, in which category would you choose? 57% chose a family member,
Yeah.
11% chose a friend, 9% an entertainer, 9% a teacher, 5% a sports figure, and 5% a pastor or a religious leader. So they're looking to the parent for that.
Right. And this is alongside all of the detachment that we have technologically. So we're still spending less time together, meaningful time than we have in the past. But children still long for it. It is God designed in us to have this deep connection with family members. And moms and dads need to understand the power that they hold when they're raising up kids.
Yeah, you wrote this book, and we'll talk about that, but you talked about the family and about the table and
Mhm.
what needs to be restored about the family. You talk about, correction here that's
Mhm.
necessary, but what needs to be fixed? What's the problem? And then we'll talk about the solution
Yeah.
here.
No, it's a great question. So there is, we can look at evidence for attachment science to understand how we can reconnect in meaningful ways so that we can have the influence that we want to have to raise up a new generation of leaders. Well, that involves eye contact, meaningful touch, words of affirmation, all these things that you could probably naturally come up with, but research bears this out now. Now, what's interesting is if you sit around a family table, all of those things, all of them happen naturally if you'll just be purposeful about one particular element of life and society. Now, it's no coincidence, I don't think, although there's not a lot of attachment in eating correlations. There's some eating disorder and attachment science things, studies, but I'm talking about just having meal times. That study doesn't exist yet. It might if I have time, in my life to write it. But I will say this: there's scads of research now demonstrating the importance of meal times with families
Hmm.
for children and teens, and just about every correlation you can name. Um, Better grades, healthier outlook, less depression, more confidence, fewer eating disorders, healthier lifestyle, on and on and on. And it all comes back to this idea of meaningful meal times. And many of those studies go back even closer, more specifically to 5 meaningful meal times. If you can have 5 meaningful meal times. Now, rewind beyond the research and you start to look at scripture. And everywhere you turn, you see the meaning of meals. There's
Hmm.
something significant that God has wired in us about sharing a meal. Just look at the book of Luke, and everywhere you turn, you see Jesus sitting down at a meal with
Mhm.
someone, many times somebody from a very different background or worldview or culture, and he's watching the barriers fall because he's there. You look at Psalm 128, your children will be as olive shoots around the table. So the idea is this picture of a healthy family around the dinner table. Probably the most significant meal in all of history is the Passover, because you can look at it there. And then in Christianity, we have the Lord's Supper. And then we think of the correlation with the wedding supper of the Lamb. Uh, it's all surrounding this deep intimacy we have with our Heavenly Father. And it surrounds, how do we remember that? Through food. So God has wired us this way that food and life and belief and conviction all go hand in hand. That's the way it's supposed to be.
I never thought I would do a podcast on food and recipes, but here we are, right?
I never thought I'd write a book about food. I can't cook, but here we are. Right.
You actually have some good recipes in the book, which I'm gonna look towards or hand them to my wife, probably, honestly. You
Yeah.
gave out a challenge to your church,
Mhm.
um, uh, around the book, around the research, around fixing this problem. What was the
Yeah.
challenge?
Well, we wanted to have, this was 8 or 9 years ago. We wanted to have one step that our parents could experience to just have a good, level of success. I kind of underestimated the power of that at the time, to be honest with you. But we said, hey, after Easter, I think it was 2015, we're going to challenge each of you to commit to 40 days where you spend 5 meaningful meal times a week with the ones you love. And we use that language intentionally because, yes, we want you with your family, but what if there's a single individual or somebody in the church? We didn't want them to be left out, somebody who lives alone. Find some people that you care about and invest in meals. We don't need to eat alone. None of us do. And so what we found through that simple exercise and lots of people committing to it, because I think people inherently know they need to do that, was much more fruit than we expected. We thought
Mm.
people would say, oh, that was nice, and maybe it'll lead to some other habits. But they started to reconnect in meaningful ways. Kids started to share some things that were going on in their lives that they had not shared
Mhm.
before. Families started to make other commitments, like let's read the Bible together. Let's spend this time together. Marriages got stronger, all over this table, and so it became an ongoing habit for a lot of our people. So that was one of the unexpected blessings that came from that. The other unexpected blessing that we discovered out of the meaningful meal times is people started to invite their neighbors in for a meal every now and then. And guess what? All the kind of the manufactured evangelism, the packaged deals that we've created over the years that sort of make us feel slimy went away, and it was just a matter of sharing some chicken and saying, "Hey, tell me your story," and winning the right to tell your own story. And so that has had ripple effects as well. It really impacted how I wrote the book. But it was a really transformational time in our church life a few years ago.
Yeah, that's great. So instead of the 40-day fast, people might like this. It's 40 days of eating.
That's true. That's true. I'm a fasting fan, but you're right. So it goes hand in hand.
So this challenge and the book too is how do you define meaningful in this
That's a really good
context
question.
of meeting
Right.
times? Because I don't know if you read the book. Richard Swenson wrote a book on margin, and he talked about,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
how little time we do have, and some of it's, self-imposed, but we spend time, driving in our cars and listening to advertisements and on Twitter and on sitcoms or whatever it might be. But how do you
Right.
define this, or how do you practically help people or even recommend making this a meaningful meeting
Well,
time?
that's really important to answer, Doug, because if we don't, then people are going to get the idea that we're talking about a meaningful mealtime being something that is otherworldly or shows up on Instagram or something like that. We're not talking about that at all. There are three components that I talk about in my book related to a meaningful mealtime. Number one, meaningful mealtimes are scheduled. Like if you don't schedule it, it's probably not going to happen. And the irony about Swanson's book Margin and this particular issue is we're all eating anyway. I know few people that are saying, I just don't have meals. Of course you do. But they're in the car or they're on the run or they're separate from others or they're in front of the cell phone. So you schedule the time together and say, listen, we're going to get together and we're going to from such and such a time. And yes, we're going to be malleable. It's not, we don't have to be rigid about this, but these 3 nights of the week we're going to be together. These 2 mornings for breakfast we're going to get up and sit around the table and do this, or these couple of lunches we're going to spend with these people and do this. So you can craft 5 meaningful meal times in that way pretty easily, but you have to put it on the calendar,
Hmm.
or other things in life will usurp them. So meaningful meal times are scheduled. Second, meaningful meal times are special. And by special, I don't mean they have 4 courses or that they're, extravagantly prepared. No, I mean that you have placed it as a priority above other elements that could be taking place at the time. So cell phones, cell phones get turned off or go away from the table. The TV's off. Distractions are away. And we're literally eyeball to eyeball having something crazy. This is an ancient term. So hang on, it's called conversation is the coolest thing. So if you can shut everything off and have conversation, it's amazing what can happen. So meaningful meal times are scheduled, they are special, and finally, this is the last component. Meaningful meal times are spiritual. It doesn't have to be a family devotion, incidentally, but what you're doing is inviting the Lord to the table. So you begin with prayer. Maybe you have one discussion, question that you have to talk about. For us, when our girls were growing up, we might have just said, "Hey, what's the best thing that happened today and the worst thing that happened today," or something along those lines. In the back of the book, we have a few questions that you can take, and also at the website restorethetable.org. So either one will work fine.
So practically, some who just haven't had the time, they're shipping their kids off to sports activities or musical
Mhm.
activities or arts, and they're just isn't the time. So scheduling it is important, but do you need to come in with an agenda and say, because you don't want to overscript the thing, right?
No, you really don't. And I'm glad you brought that up because some families are saying, we're in a season of life. We're so busy. We have Little League. We have all these. Okay. Well, can you do it in the car? Sure. I mean,
Mm.
there were times when our girls were in those busy seasons that we would go get some barbecue someplace and we'd pop the back of the minivan and sit in the back and have a picnic before we went to the event.
Mhm.
That was definitely a meaningful mealtime they still think about. It could be breakfast, as I mentioned. It could be a lunchtime. It doesn't even have to be that evening hour. In fact, I talk a little bit about the history of mealtimes. The idea of the evening meal being the largest meal in America is a fairly new phenomenon. It
Hmm.
doesn't matter the time. It just matters about, finding the spot where you schedule it, you set it apart and get creative.
And even if you fail at that, because it, it doesn't sound five meals a week doesn't sound like a lot, but if you haven't done it before, just
Mhm.
shoot for a couple, right? And start off somewhere and say, well, this looks free on my calendar. I don't have a late meeting, so I'll do this one night, and maybe we do go out to eat. But even taking someone out, the table is external to the home, is you still have the opportunity. We have so
Sure.
many fruitful conversations just over that time of breaking bread.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'd love for people to start with two meaningful meal times. However, I'm passionate about this enough. I'm going to tell your audience, listen, if you will try it for 40 days, you'll never go back because there are very few elements in life or family life that can make such an impact. And listen, and going back to the leadership conversation, Doug, I think both of us can agree when we look around our culture right now, there is a vacuum of strong leaders,
Mhm.
and if the greatest leadership training is parenting, and we know that that's true, statistically, I'm convinced of it completely, then don't we owe it to the next generation to invest that time in leadership? I don't know that we have an absence of great baseball players, but we're investing the time in Little League Baseball. I don't know that we have an absence of great violinists. I'm all for these things, but we'll invest the time with our kids to do that. So, yes, there's something about 5 times around the table consistently that makes a difference. So, yes, two is better than none, but five is like infinitely better than two. So,
That's good. And you're
there you go.
talking baseball here, so you reminded me. I just happened to have.
I'm not surprised. Oh
I
man,
just
come on.
I
All
just
right,
happened to
so
have.
I'm a Houston Astros fan here in West Houston, and yes, this is definitely the Rangers' year. So congratulations.
I'll
That's
I'll
fine.
probably never get to do it again. So I had
You
to. I
never
had
know.
to.
Yeah, you never know.
Hey, so in discussing leadership, family leadership,
Right.
whose role is this? Here we go. A little controversial topic for you, or maybe not. Whose job is this?
No,
Mom,
I
Dad?
don't think so. This is mom and dad. And I would say mom and dad and then the church. So often we think it's the church. And we tried to reverse that whole paradigm here at Kingsland with some really intentional, uh, values that we hold and talk about often. So that's the first part. That's not as controversial, but it's really important because a lot of people in their mind grew up in a mindset of saying, well, I need to get my kids to the church so they can learn about Jesus and that
Mhm.
they can lead them to the Lord and they can become a Christian. No, that's not our job. That's your job. So we're going to empower you to have that job. Teens, same thing. We're going to give you everything, mom and dad, so that you can speak to your teenager. So once you get home, whose job is it? It is mom and dad. Now, far too often over the last 50 years in America, it has been the mom who has been the primary faith trainer at home. And that's a paradigm, I'm not sure where it started, where we had this idea that it's not very masculine to be the spiritual leader of your home or to speak about these things or pray with your family. But you look throughout scripture and it was the father who took that step. It's the father who's charged to do this, over and over again. Now, mom is right alongside him. So here's what I charge our dads at Kingsland. We use a two-word term when we talk about leadership in the home. This is all it means. It doesn't mean that you're the loudest or the angriest or that you get your way. None of that. No, that's not how servant leadership works. It means go first. That's it. Go
Mm.
first. So if you know that we need these things, don't wait on somebody else to plan it. You go first. Hey, it might even mean we joked about we're not really the cooks in our family, and I'm grateful that my wife is a great cook. But if we need mealtime and mom's busy, we say, okay, let's figure this out. Maybe I'm going to go first and figure out how
Mhm.
to cook something up. Maybe it's tacos, or I can do a really good omelet. You can have a meaningful mealtime around omelets,
Yeah.
but dad needs to be involved in this process. But it's the mom and the dad together. That's the power team. Now, here's where the church comes in. We have plenty of families who come into Kingsland who are single parent homes or challenged homes, or maybe they're the only ones who come and mom and dad aren't a part of the congregation. If that's the case, then the church is supposed to surround that family and fill in the gaps that the family cannot. That's straight out of 1 Timothy 5 when Paul's instructing Timothy on how to deal with widows. So when there is somebody who's hurting, the family's supposed to do what the family was uniquely designed to do. When they can't, then the church comes alongside. That's what we try to do, right? And so who's supposed to disciple those children at home? Dad, mom, with the covering of the church. You need all three.
That's good. That's good. And there may be some people who are uncomfortable or they haven't tried that before. I remember my wife and
Yep.
I went to a marriage conference and I was quite frankly told that you are to lead and you are to go first. I like that. And one of those things is praying together as spouses. And I had never done that before. And so, you know, taking that step of faith to be able to just, even if it's a simple prayer and just doing that with your wife, and
Right.
that is leadership, is being willing to take a risk
It's
and
good.
fail, and nobody's going to be analyzing your prayer or your mealtime. It's you and your spouse, and it's you and your family. So take that
Right.
risk.
I totally agree, Doug. And I'll add one caveat. Yes, I'm biased, but I have to tell you, if you talk about praying as a family or leading a conversation with a family, there is a massive difference in the intimidation factor. If you're sitting in the living room and saying, hey, everybody, let's bow for prayer, and sitting around a table with food and saying, hey, guys, I'm so glad to be with you. Let's pray. And
Hmm.
then saying, hey, what do you think about this that happened today? Did you see this? Did you hear about this on the news? How do you feel about that? What does God have to say about that? All of a sudden, the pressure comes way down when you have a meal in front of you.
Yeah, we used to do family fun nights. There's a whole curriculum around that where
Yeah.
you make the devotional or the time, the spiritual
Right.
time, as there's actually I'll put it on the screen here if I can find it if they're still around. Introduction to Family Fun Nights, and those
Yeah.
were
Heritage
things that
Builders, Jim Weidman, Kurt Bruner, good stuff. Yeah.
perfect. So there's practical ways to do that, and I think you had in your appendix of the book some easy questions. Just bring one question.
Sure.
Don't bring Romans chapter 8 to dinner with you. You can do that, but just bring
Right.
one thing as a topical discussion, and that will lead you to greater discussions about spiritual
That's right.
things.
No
Tell
doubt.
me, so shifting gears a little bit, let's
Mhm.
apply this concept in the workplace. You mentioned someone named Ralph, I think it
Yeah.
was. And it
Hmm.
was I was pretty jealous as I was reading that going, I wish I had a
Yeah.
Ralph in my life.
Yeah.
Well, depending on
Yeah.
where you're at, you can be that Ralph to someone, or you
Mhm.
can look for that Ralph. Tell me about Ralph a little bit.
Yeah, everybody needs a Ralph Smith. In fact, so much so, you read the portion of the book. I ended up dedicating the book to Dr. Ralph Smith. Dr. Ralph Smith is now in heaven, has passed away a few years ago. He was a pastor, a retired pastor in the Austin area when I was pastoring there, and was 40 years older than me. And we'd get together once a week or every 2 weeks for either coffee or lunch, most often around a meal. And there you go again, but to just do life together. And we rarely had an agenda. I mean, probably when we started, we may have had some questions, awkward questions, but soon after we had enough relationship, I'd sit down and say, Ralph, here's what I'm struggling with. These are some of the challenges I'm facing. What do you think about this? Sometimes he would come and say, Ryan, you've been on my mind. I'm thinking about this. Or maybe he had visited the church and he'd be real honest with me. Ryan, your endings of your sermons are weak right now. You need to work on this and this and this. But I love that man. And over 1,000 meals, he spoke into my life. Everybody needs a guy like that. And by the way, I believe everybody can be more fulfilled if they'll invest in someone else that way.
Yeah, I didn't have that in my life, and so I endeavored to figure out a way to do that. And so I actually started in our small group at church, our discipleship Sunday school class,
Awesome.
is there was not a place to have that time outside of church or outside of the family as a man or as a woman too. And so I just asked if we could start a men's small group. And so we started to go to breakfast at Panera once a week. And so again, don't put the pressure on yourself that you need to be the Bible teacher, the
It's
theologian
good.
when you do
Yep.
something like this. Just get to the table, right?
Hmm.
Get to the cup of coffee and start the dialogue, and even just talk about the last week's sermon or have a topical discussion. But that thing has gone on for 12 years now, and we've seen two men pass away, and we've been there for each other during cancer. And so even at the workplace, if you don't, there may not be a natural place to do that, but you may be connected with certain people, or do that with your team and make it
Yeah.
optional. We're going to have a once a week book club. There's a way. We did a book study, and it wasn't again, the book of Luke, but it was a book on leadership, and we started to get together, and you find yourself getting to know people, and those relationships that are built lead to transformation and results in the workplace. Why? Because you as a leader have invested. And James McGregor Burns
Sure.
and followership, and he talked a lot about finding out the needs of your followers and meeting those needs. So there's a great place to be able to have table ministry or table time at work.
Absolutely. And as you know, Doug, the funny thing about it is if you'll invest in others and make yourself available to mentoring, you always end up being the one that's the most sharpened. I mean, because I have to stay on top of things when I'm investing in other people, when I'm going to see them, when I'm having these conversations. I came straight into this room from a gathering with part of our staff at our North Katy campus uh, at a barbecue restaurant. We just sat down and we're doing life together. There was no agenda, just a chance to talk about what we're excited about right now and for them to ask some questions. It's so natural, but it is like this lost art in a lot of organizations and families today.
Well, it's great that it's not just an idea. It's one of those things is good to
Mhm.
do, right? But what you
Yeah.
brought in is research to substantiate that. And so this whole concept of a shared table. I think chapter 9 in your book, you talked about go sit at someone's table and change the world. So that may not
Yeah.
be your agenda. You don't bring in PowerPoint the first meeting to say, here's how we're going to change
Right.
the world, right?
Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
you start to find projects. One of our we started to volunteer for a Christmas homeless celebration. And that came out of one of these small group meetings, is people have ideas, and you can go literally change the world out of something that starts at the table.
Yeah. Isn't that incredible? That's
Yeah,
so cool.
it's
Doug, if we
great.
have time, I'll
Usually,
tell you one other story that's just crazy that applies to another text I got today. So, our little cul-de-sac of our neighborhood, we live in a very international community. We have neighbors next door from India. Their neighbors are from England. Their neighbors are from China. Their neighbors are from Louisiana. And let's be honest, Louisiana is almost like a foreign country. And so there's others there. We've gotten to know one another really since COVID, and we started to share meals together. And what happened was, the walls just fall down. We have almost nothing in common other than our proximity. And yet, as we've had meals together, we've shared one another's story. So, what's happened is our neighbors next door kind of picked up on this a few months ago. They're Hindu, by the way, and they texted the whole group and said, "Hey, we should just make this a regular thing." They scheduled it. Let's meet at this Italian restaurant on such and such a night. So we did that a couple months ago. And I just got a text from our Louisiana neighbors who said, "You know what? We're supposed to host the next one. So what date works for you?" So they're scheduling these meals in the cul-de-sac uh, together because I think they already say we need this. So we may have kind of planted the seed, but everybody inherently from pretty much every walk of life knows that this matters.
Hmm. Yeah, you talked about, I think in your book, it was table in the storm. And
Yeah.
we
Mhm.
one of my work groups, I got together and we started to do a small group setting, and found that one of my employees actually had a passion for volunteer work with veterans and Habitat for Humanity. So we actually started within our group. We had a one weekend where we went out and helped to build a house, and I couldn't even be there for it. So I'm sitting here
Wow.
as the facilitator that helped to organize it, but she had the passion, and so we had 20 people that showed up to build a home, and then it expanded out of our group and our function to even be a broader effort. And so your church has
Amazing.
done that, right? With Table in the Storm. Can you talk a little bit kind of about that in closing?
Sure. So 2017, a lot of you remember what happened in the Houston area. Hurricane Harvey came through, and then a couple days after this immense rain, we had a massive flood as some of the drainage systems didn't work in the city. And so in West Houston and Katy especially, we had thousands and thousands of people out of their homes. It was like a war zone. We had helicopters overhead rescuing people, boats everywhere coming in and out. The campus, the central campus of Kingsland, where I get to serve as pastor, became the Red Cross outpost for a feeding center, which seemed fitting for us. And so we were able to share about 20,000 meals a day. And then following that, when we kind of had the aftermath and we were trying to minister to these precious families that had lost everything material in their lives, we scheduled a number of meals just to come together and have dinner. Not that they didn't have meals or food available at this time, but so that they could unpack and share their stories with one another. And it's very special bond was created over that season. And it was a reminder once again how God can take food and take a really difficult situation, redeem it, and create new life and new friends together, new hope. And that's what we saw. And frankly, that's what I
Great.
see all over the place. It's just really cool to see what the Lord can do.
That's a great story. I encourage people, and maybe you can give us one last word on this as a pastor. Obviously, people would say you're biased, but the
Mhm.
church, right, and our society, and some people may not belong to a church. They may
Right.
have been burned by people in a church, but this whole concept of community and finding places to plug in. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Our mission statement as a church is inviting all people to experience true fulfillment in Jesus Christ, one home at a time. And I recognize that a lot of people are not buying into the Christian side of things in our community, in our culture, in our nation. But I think all of us understand the meaning of true fulfillment. The reason we brought that phrase out was because so many people are discovering places of false fulfillment. They thought they'd be fulfilled if they had the right job, the right car, the right home, their kids got in the right school, and they get there and say, "Wait a second, that's it." But we all deeply need fulfillment in our hearts. We want peace. Everybody needs fulfillment in their family. Everybody wants to leave a legacy. They want their kids to have something better than they had. I don't know anybody who doesn't want to have fulfillment in community. All of us do. And I don't know anybody who doesn't want fulfillment beyond that, where they have something outliving themselves, where they're investing in something, building something, making a difference. And the interesting thing is, you can use a simple tool like the mealtime to bring community together. And when you have community, even with people very different from you start to find that there's something so much deeper, so much more lasting. As the home goes, so goes the nation. And we see that all the time. I know you can tell by now to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Everything I see is a family problem. And here's what's interesting about that. It doesn't really matter your worldview. If you take an honest look at what we see around us, we recognize that we have a desperate need for home. Most of us are shaped by our home lives for good or bad. And the reality is, Doug, even as we're having this conversation, our moms and dads are sort of behind us, instructing us even if it was a difficult situation for people, the primary caregivers are the ones that drove them and kind of shaped them. Now we can undo some things, we can enhance some things, but that's where it starts. And if that's where it starts, man, how important is it that we recognize the importance of home? And so if you want to make an impact, you want to leave a legacy. Yes, my own bias is find a church, engage other people. You need community, but start with your family. Man, invest in your home. Take the time to be present for the ones you love. And just that little thing, we were not designed for this to be complicated. We've just made it complicated because we're so distracted.
Yeah, and get creative. I know the people watching this are creative, the grandparents, and set
Yeah.
up, during the pandemic, people set up Zoom calls, have a Zoom picnic. I mean,
Yeah.
as a grandparent, you can come up with creative ways, go to a sporting event, bring a picnic. There's a lot of ways that you can do this. Same thing in the workplace.
I love that. In fact, let me give one other plug. This is completely free resources, but our church has set up a website called empoweredhomes.org. Empoweredhomes.org. Everything on the website is free. There are thousands of resources that we put there, videos, discussion guides, pamphlets, podcasts, and it's all there for parents and leaders to take and to use to enhance home life. So there's everything you can imagine is there. We've just tried to open it up so everything's free.
Well, appreciate it, Ryan. I'll put that as a link in here as well. So everyone, Dr. Ryan Rush, Pastor Ryan Rush, but more importantly, father and spouse, Ryan Rush. And so I really appreciate the challenge and the time you spent, and believe that your book, Restore the Table, will be a great benefit to all. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Doug Hagedorn, thank you for all you're doing in the leadership space, and you're making a huge impact. Thank you. I appreciate your friendship.
Take care.